So here we are. This is kind of my magnum opus to a certain degree, although there are so many, as you all know, subjects and nuances to the world of landscapes, native plant communities, wildlife interactions, etc. And many of you, I think, well, I know that everyone here has information that experiential and otherwise that can fill in parts where, you know, I might skim over or whatnot. So feel free to make comments in the chat, especially if you do have a question, and then I can come to those later on. So this talk is all about creating edible and native landscapes, of course, and really what this is about is creating productive ecosystems. And so looking at how we can incorporate food and native plants together. Some of those are one and the same, as you well know. And creating these productive landscapes that can also fit our lifestyle and be relatively low maintenance, even in comparison to a lot of the traditional landscaping we see. And this is perhaps on the farther end of the ecosystem foodscape spectrum. This is my friend Andy and Sunshine's place down in Winona, and they live at Wiskoy Land Cooperative next to Prairie Moon, and Sunshine manages the bare root operation there. I always love heading down to their place. That's their garden in August. Okay, so looks like, okay, I scroll down. So this is me. Roger gave me an intro. This is at a planting up in Lindstrom, Minnesota with Great River Greening. I love to get out volunteering, and it's really all about connecting both with earth and with the community. So an aspect of what I really love to bring in with this whole world of edible meets native landscaping is that I also have a marketing background, and it's so easy to get people excited about creating healthy landscapes that provide for us, provide for wildlife, ecosystem services, etc., when we have so many benefits that the blend of this edible and native landscape provides. And so you can see how many people came out just for this Great River Greening event, feeling good about planting trees in this beautiful park that's actually an old farm. These are old terraces that were used for grain production. And the amount of work that we can get done when we're partnering with our friends, with our community, interest groups is truly astounding. I'm sure a lot of you have had this experience. And this is something that I really emphasize in looking at how we evolve as a community, especially looking at things with COVID-19 and everything going on in the world right now. I'm getting really active in the local food production in our community and looking at how we can become more resilient and more connected to perhaps reality, and also creating a high standard of living for everyone in our local area by virtue of connecting more closely with nature, producing more food, creating more habitat, etc. There are ripple effects across society, across the environment. And when we bring people together, even if it's just a few people on a weekend to help you put in a rain garden, something like that, it goes faster, it's a lot more fun, everybody learns something. There's this myriad that's to it. So my journey unfolds, and Mom, you would recognize this. This is my parents' backyard, and then straight in the center behind the grill there is a gigantic pagoda dogwood growing in full sun, believe it or not. But this is really about the fact that to incorporate more edible, more native, more benefits into your landscape, it really doesn't have to be, and shouldn't be in a lot of cases, starting from a clean slate. You don't have to get rid of everything you've already got. There's a lot that we can work with in our landscapes that we can pick and choose where our priority areas are, where the herb garden might go out the back door, the pollinator patch might go out in front to show people how beautiful a native landscape can be. Our journey really unfolds where we're at. So this is really what this talk is about, is meeting you where you might be at with your property, or perhaps you live in an apartment, but you've got some friends with some space. So starting with how the landscape is really laid out, I don't want to belittle the process, because as a designer, there's a lot that goes into figuring out what does this system actually look like that we might be putting in. For example, this is a terraced food garden with some initial habitat plantings, some beneficial insect plantings around. It looks very sparse right now. This was a very new planting, but you can see how the materiality is very simple. There's some gravel in the utilitarian areas, that gray stuff. There's the soil, the beds where the herbs, where the flowers, where the vegetables are going to go for edible uses. There's right outside the garden where we're blending in to the more perennial landscape, where we're bringing in some more plants, native plants for beneficial insects, both pollinators and the myriad, parasitic wasps, flies, other cool, once we get under those spruce trees, beetles and things that we can bring in. But one thing I really like to point out here is that form meets function, in the sense that, we're looking at how this can not only be beautiful and function ecologically, but at the same time, you can see just even these curves and the edging here, they're gracious. They look, beautiful and neat and to a degree. And really what they're doing is that they're just really easy to mow along. They're really easy to run a riding mower or a push mower along the edge there. And that's one of the reasons for the uniformity that creates this recognizable form to us that feels like, oh, this is a place that's being cared for. So it doesn't have to be rocket science to figure out a layout. Another piece that I really look at, starting from, we're going kind of from the top down, we'll get more detailed as time goes on with plants and things, but looking at path hierarchy as we're looking at our landscape. And in your yard, for example, you may have areas where you need to get a wheelbarrow through, or you might need to, even with this dotted line that runs up the left side here, you might even need to get a vehicle in from time to time to dump compost or wood chips. And some of these smaller paths, you may have areas where it's simply for walking around while you're maintaining small garden areas. So these are really some of the things that I'm looking at. And I know that it can help us to start to look at framing and dividing up a space, not to compartmentalize it and create separateness in a landscape, because it should all integrate and function together. But at the same time, really looking at how can we make it easier on our minds when we're starting to break up a space, and not only from the human standpoint, but also the soil standpoint, the edges where the birds may congregate, things like that. And it's really something where the landscape doesn't have to be so overwhelming in the sense of all the possibilities, because the information is all there. It's simply about observation. I'm gonna take a drink. I'm drinking silver maple sap from trees right outside, and it is delicious. So keeping the neighbors happy, aesthetics. And you can see here, this is a landscape with some native grasses, some forbs and things. And I can see this looks a little bit blurry to me, so I apologize for that. What is really happening here is that we have a native pseudo prairie planting. This is a smaller planting, but we also have a very key component to keeping the neighbors happy. You can see this mown path, and I was just talking with a client today, and they asked me if I had made up the word mown. I may have, but it sounds pretty great to me. So we have a mown path through the middle here. One of the things that I've found, and that numerous studies have found, is that we can have this beautiful native meadow, for example, that a lot of people who just aren't in the know, they haven't been exposed to this type of landscape before, especially in a residential setting, might think, oh, this is all weeds, you need to mow it, get it out of there, it's gonna breed ticks and other things. But ultimately, it can go such a long way to putting in a few simple, what are called cues to care. Maybe it's a mown path, maybe it's the edge of, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the edge of the sidewalk there, of a few feet of that mown. So it's not something where you have plants necessarily encroaching on the sidewalk. It's obvious that somebody is attending to this area to a certain degree, especially with something like a bench. You can see that there's a purpose beyond just idle land, quote unquote idle, right? This isn't, this is really when we're looking to make landscapes such as this more accessible to the public who might have a career in finance, or something that may not be related to natural resources. and we're helping them, we're just getting a foot in the door and helping them see how much more enjoyment really we can get out of our landscapes. So I'm moving through an overview of important points to know, and so this will jump around just a little bit, but at the base here, we're starting with looking at soil health. So looking at some of that form and how we might bring in a landscape that is easy to kind of get our head around initially. This is where we really start to get an idea of what's going on. Is we're starting with soils, and we're looking at some other conditions as well at the site. So this is a pretty run-of-the-mill test from the University of Minnesota. I'm sure a lot of you are nodding your head. You're like, oh yeah, I recognize that. And this is something that I have people do whenever we're working on their yard or larger farm property, for example. And you can see we're getting some basic information here. Phosphorus, potassium, really important components. Phosphorus should always actually be higher than potassium in a balanced soil. pH is a really important consideration. You know, things like blueberries, lower pH, many plants from certain habitat types are specific to a certain range of pH. Generally in the 5.5 to 6.5 range is considered kind of run-of-the-mill for more of the general plant types that can handle, it's just kind of covers the most ground for the most types of plants that work in that 5.5 to 6.5 pH range. Here, what I wanted to point out is that not only is the pH actually higher than most soils, which isn't necessarily an issue, and that's why natives are great, because we can find natives that grow in that type of soil, but the phosphorus here is very high, and that's quite characteristic of any soil where lawn fertilizer has been applied for a long time. When you're digging for the soil test, the grass roots aren't long enough to actually access a lot of the fertilizer that's being put. Either it runs off into local waterways, or it may actually get below where the grass roots can reach it. So we actually found here that they don't need to fertilize, at least with something that contains phosphorus, for quite a while, and that can help, especially with our local water quality, because that is a water-soluble nutrient. And really what this comes down to is, with a lot of these things in the landscape, regardless of the type of landscape that we're putting in, we're really looking at how can we potentially increase organic matter. Granted, you may have a sandy site where you really want to work with some plants that love sand. So this isn't about saying that, oh, well, we really need to change this site in order for it to be a good place to garden. But soil life does thrive in higher organic matter soils. And so you see how dark this soil is. The earthworm, I mean, some of you may be thinking, oh, those darn earthworms, they're great for garden soil for vegetables, but they do eat a lot of the debris on the ground, and flower seeds and other things. They're responsible for a lot of denuding of our forest floors, especially these non-native earthworms. But this dark soil is really dark. This is a point where I usually ask people, why is the soil dark? Why is fertile soil dark? Well, it's because there's a lot of carbon in there. There's a lot of long-chained humic acids and these other great things that are mostly decomposed plant material, but that are going to provide food for microorganisms of all kinds for a long time, and also help with air getting into the soil. It helps create some pore space for air to get in. Plants' roots need oxygen, and it helps the soil hold water so that it's available to our plants for their needs. And increasing fungi in soil is a big part of this. So a lot of our soils end up having an overabundance of bacteria, but not so much fungi. And that's partially because fungi thrive on that organic matter in the soil and higher moisture content that comes with higher organic matter. So this is a young puffball mushroom. And increasing fungi in the soil doesn't have to be a hard thing to do. One of the things that I always recommend, and I'm sure, I may be preaching to the choir to some degree, A lot of these techniques of gardening, such as raking up your leaves and putting them in your garden beds for the winter, helping to mulch plants, keep them safe from really penetrating frosts. It also adds a lot of organic matter, and I call it residual organic matter, stuff that doesn't break down fully right away to our soil. It doesn't burn up right away, so it's going to help protect the soil from exposure, to even compaction from dripping rain, which does compact soil, to building that organic matter to increase fungi, which for almost all woody plants especially is crucial to that plant being able to get more nutrition from the soil. The plant exchanges sugars, the fungi, which help the plant reach more nutrition. And fertility is such a subjective thing. So you can see on the right here, we've got the veggie garden, beautiful, productive garden. It needs high fertility. You know, a lot of these plants, one, we're eating them, so we want high nutritional value. We want nutritional density. We want it's called a high BRICS rating. We want a lot of sugars of different carbohydrates to be in those plant leaves. It helps with pest and disease resilience and makes them more nutritionally dense. And a lot of these vegetable plants have been bred so that they don't really have, especially since they're annual, they don't have that really well-developed root system. They need access right at the surface in a lot of cases to that nutritionally dense, high organic matter soil. On the left here, you know, these soils underneath this big blue stem, coneflower, bee balm could indeed be very fertile. And in fact, you know, this particular set of species, these are quite common in a prairie planting, especially a quote unquote restoration. These could be fertile soils. These plants can handle a wider range. And that's one of the reasons why I love working with plants, is because we don't have to have just those fertile black soils. Of course, there are native plants that are adapted to those higher fertility, higher organic matter soils, but there are so many, and even some of the ones that we're looking at here on the left, and other woody plants, etc. Think of things like sand cherry or beach plum, for example, plants that are growing on pure sand. A lot of other plants that thrive in those conditions, hoary puccoon, for example. And then there are plants such as, especially if you see different natives at the wetland edge, such as highbush cranberry, our viburnums, you know, a lot of those fruiting shrubs really love those higher fertility soils, plants that like those wet areas. So we can use natives in some places where perhaps edibles aren't going to work. And I'm also, I want to say, let me move to the next slide. I'm also not dogmatic about native or edible. Like, you know, you can use whatever you want. And of course, it's important to look at, is this plant overly aggressive or potentially invasive? It's a really important consideration, not only from an ecological standpoint, but a maintenance standpoint for you. And this is really about a democratization of the landscape, and bringing in the native and edible, but also, you know, if you want a smoke bush, put in a smoke bush. They're awesome. And creating a stable plant community is about looking at not necessarily the aesthetics of this particular garden, although I think the whimsical nature of this kind of fairyland is really cool. This might not be your cup of tea, but what we can take from this example here is that this garden is utilizing vertical structure in terms of, you've got this arbor being covered, you've got these different areas where the amount of solar energy that's coming down from above is being utilized and perhaps turned into fruit or turned into beautiful flowers that the bees and the skippers and the hummingbird moths are coming to visit. And we're also looking at not only the vertical, but the horizontal in the garden. So a lot of gardens that I see, you know, we might have, and I know you guys are really the choir when it comes to this, but we might have some hostas in a traditional landscape, some junipers, some weigela, things like that. But if we really look at a lot of the space horizontally on the ground, there's just a lot of negative space. There's a lot of open space. And while that can be used to our advantage from an aesthetic standpoint, it doesn't, and in a lot of cases, in my opinion, shouldn't be open space, because that's where we get, especially if there's exposed soil, that's where we're getting potential weeds coming in. It's really looking at how we can bring things in, such as creeping thyme or sheep sorrel, some other spreading plants, wild geranium, things like that, maybe garden sage, that are mounding and spreading in between some of these larger, taller plants to fill things in. And also, as I'll talk about later, bring in some other textures and colors and forms and flavors and wildlife. So the landscape diversity and ecological function, the main point here is that you can see this is probably July, and all of these plants are in bloom. The yarrow, the gray-headed coneflower, the bee balm. It's the same picture I showed you earlier. And it's so important to look at not only July, but the fact that since we have this plethora of diversity in our region, and actually, guys, I want to check on I just need to plug in my computer so it doesn't lose it. We have this plethora, this amazing native diversity here in Minnesota. When you're out in Oregon, when you're in some of those Western states, there are beautiful plants, but we actually have such a high degree of diversity here. We're truly blessed. And so we've got plants that are going to start blooming in, I've got some weird animals clicking outside. It's distracting me. We've got a lot of wildlife here at the farm, but we've got plants that bloom from April, different species that'll bloom in April, May, other species such as goldenrod, the asters, and a number of other things that are blooming later in the year. And for example, right now we've got the willows are coming in and they're starting to bloom, which is a really important pollen source for our early honeybees and other pollinators. Of course, honeybees are not native, but I am fond. Insectary plantings. This is in Oakland, California, and one thing that I wanted to point out here is you can see the diversity of different plants. Not only is that planted for aesthetics, it's also planted for pollinator forage. One of the great things that we can bring in is some extra housing for pollinators. In this particular case, although this looks really cool to have everything clustered in one place, it actually presents a potential issue because we're clustering all of this habitat in one spot, which is highly abnormal for a native landscape. So if you are going to put out some hollow stem things, maybe, I'm totally throwing things out there. There perhaps Joe Pye. I know there are some other taller wildflowers that have those hollow stems that you can set out for some of our native bees, for example, to lay their eggs in and create their nest, the solitary bees to create their nests in. We can drill holes of various diameters and blocks of wood for mason and leafcutter bees, things like that. But we want to really set those around the landscape. And there's more information available online about that. Feel free to ask more questions later on as well. But that's something where we really want to mimic the native kind of dispersal of these things around the landscape versus just do what is pretty, especially when it comes to the safety and health of our wildlife. So we're getting in here to looking at how this really applies to you and your situation and understanding what it is that you really want to commit to, because it's going to take time regardless of what we do in the yard. And I'm sure a lot of you are looking around your yard thinking, what am I going to focus on this year? And it's really important to not focus on everything, right? So I always recommend starting small. And if you've got a vegetable garden, you're just getting started, starting with that smaller area where you can do a really great job planting a cover crop such as spring oats and then summer buckwheat in another area. If you've got an open area you don't want to deal with, cover crops are a really great tool that I'll talk about a bit later on to get both to hold over open areas and protect them, provide some pollinator forage in the case of buckwheat, and also potentially to get rid of, help get rid of some weeds and suppress things like thistles and others while we're preparing an area to be seeded in the fall, for example. And so it's really about your lifestyle. Are you going to be around when you need to harvest those apples that you're planting, or the raspberries? I'll talk a little bit about spotted wing Drosophila fruit fly in a little bit, which is an important consideration when you're thinking about, are you actually around to take care of things and be a responsible steward of the landscape? Harvest and processing, this is so getting ahead of myself. And this is wild plum and wild grape, two plants that I really love. And I don't have them in my own landscape necessarily because there's so much of them in our roadsides and at parks, especially at our forest edges or edges of old fields. There's a lot of things out in the landscape that we don't have to maintain, but are providing fruit on a fairly regular basis annually for us. And so it's not only looking at the harvest, but how are you going to process this? Because you're not just going to pick a ton of wild plums. And I mean, maybe you might be the type of person to eat them fresh, but a lot of times these things need to be cooked. Or apples, you've got so many of them. Are you going to give them away? Are you going to make applesauce? You got a huge bumper crop of tomatoes. Are you planning that into your schedule? Like, okay, I know in this 2-week window, I'm going to have 20 pounds of tomatoes. Do I actually have things in place and have some friends coming over to help me take care of that and get some for themselves? Cover crops. So one piece about this is simply that they are very effective for helping to protect soil from erosion. For example, planting winter rye in, say, late September before things get too cold, rye will actually grow to 35 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's something that's really great to plant in the fall and hold over your open areas, or perhaps just planting an area where you don't really know what to do with yet, but you want to protect it. Cover crops such as buckwheat and radishes can help to be a green manure crop for you and add organic matter to the soil. Radishes can break up clay and are a really great, quick to establish cover crop. Oats, for example, and I think rye to a certain degree, but especially oats, have allelopathic chemicals, which are just chemicals that they exude, which prevent the germination of other plants while they're growing, and also up to 2 weeks after you cut them down. So just remember that some of these plants may actually prevent other things from thriving until you let them break down a little bit in the soil. So this is a very grainy photo. I've been searching for a better one. It looks like some type of weird video game, primitive video game. This is an amazing man named Charles Dowding. And one thing I'd love to emphasize is no-till production. And while you may use a rototiller, it's really ideal for your soils to limit or entirely eliminate tilling, because we talked about that fungi earlier, and fungi are integral to the health of soil. They exude, I forgot what the term is, but they exude these kind of like these slimy, sugary substances that help soil aggregate and cluster up. That's why, aside from worm castings, that's why you see a healthy organic matter rich soil is nice and clumpy and clustery to a certain degree. And that's part of the benefit of having fungi in the soil, is the moisture retention, the clustering, the aggregation is so important. But a really easy way to do no-till is to put down a 1-inch layer of compost. There's a really amazing company called Cowsmo, COWSMO compost. And granted, with the COVID stuff going on, you know, it's hard to say who's open and who's not, or if it's really responsible to venture out and get things. At my parents' place, we're probably going to get a delivery of Cowsmo compost, because you can lay down 1 inch of compost. This is what I did when I was farming vegetables, and we lay down that inch. So we're creating this nice seed bed, because that's why a lot of us are tilling, is to create that nice seed bed, also to reduce weeds. So you lay down 1 inch of compost, you have that nice seed bed, you have the reduction of at least young weeds coming up. You can seed into that, you can plant your veggie starts into that, and then put straw over it. And this man, Charles Dowding here, he's harvesting some lettuce, and in the middle, that kind of beige looking clumpy, those rows right behind him are onions he's just harvested. He lays down that layer of compost, and he has hardly any weeds. And straw is really important in our particular climate for not only weed suppression, but moisture retention. It's also important to get straw, not hay, because straw is and should be just the stems of a harvested grain without any seed heads, so you won't be getting weed seeds. So, and I'll be, there's something going on with the PDF here, so I apologize for the graininess, but you can see this is University of Minnesota Extension. I really, really love this website. I'm sure a number of you have used this. One thing that I really want to point out here is that we're looking at not only is this plant hardy, will it survive our winters, but we're also looking at disease resistance, because I see so many people, I know Honeycrisp is delicious and these like Z-Star and other things, but a lot of these more recent introductions, I don't want to poo-poo U of M because we use 7 of their blueberry varieties in our blueberry farm, and part of that, having made that decision, the person who used to own the farm, who did all that work, was has resulted in our farm, Blueberry Fields of Stillwater, just touting us a little bit, is the most productive blueberry farm per acre in the state of Minnesota. So U of M knows what they're doing, but at the same time, you can use these resources to find plants that are not only hardy, but they'll have lists for raspberries, for apples, for blueberries, for honeyberries. Honeyberry is a really great plant that I love. It's the early fruiting berry. And it'll tell you, is it disease resistant to certain common diseases? Is it hardy? Is it very productive? Does it have thorns? Does it have, you know, it's these different characteristics that are more experiential that you can get all in one place. I use this all the time when I'm working on designs. Oopsies. So pollination for fruit set. And I talked about honeyberry. If you're not familiar with it, it's in the Lonicera, the honeysuckle genus. It is not a native here. It's a native to, I believe, Siberia and Russia. I think there's some native to Japan, perhaps. And it's an early fruiting berry. And one of the great things about this is I'll talk about spotted wing Drosophila later on. Honeyberry fruits before that insect comes out in the summer. It'll fruit in probably late June. And it's really excellent for mitigating that in a time sense, but also for some of these plants, not all of them, but a number, especially when you're looking at fruit trees, looking at having different varieties. Plants, just like people and animals, want to have genetic diversity, and so they like to pollinate with pollen that's not from their same genetics. If we've got a Honeycrisp apple, all of those apples are genetically absolutely identical to each other. They're all cloned. And so not only is that a potential issue for disease resilience in a garden where we're actually counting on food production, but it's not going to bode well for pollination. That's why a lot of people have a crab apple to flower at the same time as their particular apple variety in their landscape. And it's a reason why honeyberries, you need multiple varieties or they won't set fruit at all. So moving back into native plants here, jumping around a little bit, and it's really looking at, for any plant we might be looking at putting in our landscape, we're looking at 3 main conditions: light and soil type and moisture levels. So we're looking at sun, which is 8 hours or more a day of sun, part shade, which would be maybe 4 to 6 hours of sun, and shade, which would be considered like 4 or less, or maybe it's like a dappled shade, something like that. Soil type, sand, silt, clay are the main things. Your soil test from the U of M will help you determine that as well. You can probably tell just from digging, is there a lot of sand or is it clay? Does it drain very well? It's by observation that you can tell also then what your moisture content may be throughout the year. You might have really dry soil in the winter, but really wet in the spring, and therefore you'd want plants that are adapted to both of those conditions. Luckily, there are a lot of natives which are. And another important piece that I consider when selecting native plants is local genotype. And this is such an important feature because when we're looking at the source of our native plants, especially, the local genotype plants are from, if we're working with a reputable source, such as some of the nurseries I'll mention later on, or for example, Prairie Moon, which just has my heart and soul because my friend Sunshine works there and they do an amazing job. Is it from local genetics? Has it been gathered from either a prairie remnant or seeds that came from a prairie remnant or a natural area? that those plants have evolved not only in our region so that they're adapted perhaps to some of the historic climate fluctuations we've had since the last ice age, but also there is, you know, I personally feel that it's important to give our native wildlife the same genes that they've been interacting with for eons. We don't know exactly how it may affect them, but if they had, for example, coneflower from New Jersey versus coneflower from Minnesota, even if they were the same species. But also, when a lot of these plants, such as coneflower, are being selected for color or scent or anything other than just, is this a hardy native plant that's been growing here and doing its own thing and providing for our wildlife for thousands of years? If we're selecting for color, scent, things like that, we don't know how that might be affecting the forage quality and palatability for our native insects, for example, or for the larvae that are feeding on the plants. And I really love looking at light, at soil type and moisture, because when we do that, we can bring in unusual natives that we might not otherwise have thought of putting in our landscape, that can really add a sense of awe and inspiration. For example, this bottle gentian is not as commonly seen. It likes, you know, I've honestly seen this in pretty sandy soils, but it generally likes a more fertile soil, higher in organic matter with higher moisture. So if you have that type of situation, you know, a lot of us, we may have access to a wet area with some sunshine. Something like this bottle gentian, it doesn't necessarily like standing water, but when we know some of these just baseline conditions that aren't too hard to figure out, soil type, sun, and moisture, I mean, there are some other aspects to this, understanding plant selection, but you really, that's really the basics of what you need to understand. Can I bring in some other natives that, for example, if you know your site conditions, you can look at prairie moon and say, oh, what's in the shady insectary plant list that's good for wet areas? And then you could see what are the other species there. You don't necessarily have to buy that plant mix. You could go to Minnesota Native Landscapes or Prairie Resto or Outback Nursery and find some of those plants in terms of, like, maybe they're in a plug form and you can pop them into your landscape and they may very well work for you. So it's a really cool way to bring in unusual stuff that can help support others, particular insects, for example. So I just wanted to pop this in, and this is part of bringing in, this is an example of actually bringing in some non-natives, but it's just, I use it because it's a very crisp, contrasting image. And this brown here, looking at seasonality and bringing in some of these aesthetics and these more unusual plants in the landscape, this is about observation of some of our more unusual natives when we're looking at making this more of a native representation. But this brown is actually a stilbe. That silvery white is Russian sage. But in front of that, we've got some coneflower. We've also got some Joe Pye weed, some other things coming in here that are examples of natives. This is a garden by a designer named Pete Widin, who is one of my absolute favorites. But this is just one example of how we can bring in, and from an aesthetic standpoint, and you may or may not agree with this, working in drifts in the landscape, these larger plantings of one thing. Some plants do cluster like that naturally, our native plants. It can create really cool layering effects, even in the winter, which this is the dormant season. You can see how beautiful and inspiring this would be to just look out the window or walk through. And planting in drifts can also potentially make our maintenance easier and create more of a consistent cover that's going to shut out weeds from coming in. So some of my favorite sources for native plants, I really like Landscape Alternatives. It's the place that I've been to the most personally. I did hear something where you just have to ask any nursery you go to whether or not their plants have ever been exposed to neonicotinoid insecticides. And this is really important. I'm sure pretty much everybody knows. They're derived from nicotine. These insecticides like imidacloprid, there's a insecticide used for emerald ash borer, that's imidacloprid, or was at one time. Some of our systemic tree injections and sprays to protect from Japanese beetles are neonicotinoids. These can just drastically affect our native pollinators and other beneficial insects. They are not specific to a species. For example, and also a lot of pesticides that are used in agriculture kill all the lepidopterans, all the butterfly and moth larvae. They don't just single out one. It's pretty much impossible to do that with any chemical. And I'd never recommend using chemicals in the landscape in general. So if you do have any questions about, you know, any controlling weeds, about controlling pests and disease in your landscape, that's something I specialize in as well. I'd be happy to answer your questions. But if you go to one of these landscapes, I just mention it in Landscape Alternatives because we're not sure with some of their stock that they might bring in where it comes from. But I love Roy so much. Minnesota Native Landscapes is the bomb. Outback has really high quality, especially trees. I've seen some really awesome trees come out of there, which can be hard to find in the native plant world. Is like a really nice quality native tree. And Prairie Resto in Princeton, Minnesota. Some really great class acts in the native nursery world, but always make sure, even if you feel like you know that they don't use neonicotinoids, unless they say on their website or something and have some, you know, real in-depth statement about it, always ask. And I will say that Gerton's is using them. So spotted wing Drosophila, this is a really important pest to be aware of. It can affect all of our soft skin fruits, and it's all widespread across the US. We've got it here for sure. We actually, we spray lavender oil here at the blueberry farm to protect the berries from them. Basically, you can't really avoid spotted wing Drosophila unless you get a really specialized netting system, which is quite expensive. You know, if you're looking to cover a single row of blueberries, you could perhaps do it. But really what it comes down to is making sure you pick your fruit either right before it's fully ripe, or if you know it does get fully ripe, getting it all off of the plant. Don't let that fruit sit there. This particular fruit fly can actually lay its eggs in underripe fruit because it has a barbed ovipositor, which is unique to that species of fruit fly. It's originally from Asia. I'm sure we've exported tons of crap to everywhere else in the world. So, you know, we have to deal with these aspects of our global economy, right? And one aspect beyond just the hygiene and getting the fruit off of the plants, out of the field, not letting stuff rot on the ground, and making sure it's being taken away from your plants so that the fruit fly can't hatch again. Those larvae don't hatch out of the mature out of the fruit and start impacting your other berries. But you can actually freeze the fruit or just cook it. The larvae is harmless, it's flavorless. It will affect the flavor of tart cherries, I hear, but otherwise it's flavorless. Consider it extra protein. Hopefully that got some laughs. And what I do is I freeze berries if I'm not gonna eat them within 24 hours of harvesting, because the larvae will just turn your fruit to mush. Pest and disease resilience, I already talked about this in the extension piece, but really make sure that when you're selecting plants, this is going to go a long way for your lifestyle component and also your emotional stability and enjoyment of the landscape. Choose varieties that are going to be resilient to pests and disease. And the U of M extension is great for edibles. In that regard, nurseries such as the Stark Brothers website is really informative. When we're getting into natives, there's not so much that we really need to be concerned about, partially because we're not looking to them across the board for production, but also because they're generally adapted, except in the case of Japanese beetle, things like that. Here we got another beautiful grainy picture. So I'll be fixing that. Sorry, you guys have to deal with that. So you can see these little white specks, mystery specks. So this is this is a clover lawn with some thyme. The thyme does like a well-drained soil, and yarrow. Yarrow is a really excellent foliage plant for alternative lawns. And of course, if you did forget to mow for a while, the yarrow would bloom. But there are some really great lawn alternative mixes out there. There's a really cool company called Twin City Seed Company, and I think they're based in Edina. And I use their low-mow fescue a lot, which is another alternative lawn. It's creeping and clumping fescue mix that can handle shady conditions. It can handle sun. It only needs to be mown maybe every 3 weeks, 4 weeks, if that, once it's established. And it's got 6-inch root system. It's much more resilient than your average turf grass. And also you can mow it to the shortness of like a soccer field if you wanted to. But these bee lawns are of course very popular, and you may be looking into that. So Twin City Seed Company has some cool mixes. I see we got 71 people. Awesome, awesome. I'm so glad you guys are soaking this up. To prep beds, you might not do this. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for your lawn. You can actually overseed those mixes into your lawn to go with a lawn alternative over time and scuff things up in especially the early spring or in the fall. Scuff things up and expose some soil and seed in some of those alternative covers, have them take over time. This is really looking at organic bed preparation for if you are installing a larger pollinator planting, maybe a parking strip in your boulevard. There's a couple different options, one of which is to, I generally do start with tilling when I do this because it's creating disturbance. We have to mimic some type of disturbance. I'm not saying you have to till. There are other ways to do it, but I found it to be very effective to, on the left is solarization. So we till, if there's sod there, we cut the sod up, we remove it. We might actually use that sod in some type of raised bed system, cover it with soil to add organic matter. But we're removing that sod, we're tilling things up, we're wetting the soil down, and then we cover it with sheet plastic for 2 to 3 months. And under this particular one, where we made a pollinator sanctuary, put that up after 3 months, and it was solid purslane. So pretty interesting to see what happened under there. On the right here, this was simply reclaiming an old area at my parents' place, pulling up buckthorn, and then running the rototiller through there and planting in some clover. Timing for seeding, I can talk about that a little bit as well. But then this is what happened after. So it doesn't look too pretty because I didn't really take care of it that well. But we seeded in some clover, and you can see that lime green area, how well that filled in. That was just from Hool's Seed here in Stillwater if you're local. Making sure you get a clover seed that's inoculated with nitrogen fixing bacteria, so you actually get that benefit, nitrogen back into the soil. But we go from this on the right to this in just about a month's time, and that's elderberry planted in those strips of cardboard between their cardboards to keep the weeds down. And I notice I jump around a fair amount, so thanks for bearing with me. Timing for seeding, I have found that across the board, when we're looking at timing for seeding, we want to hit those times. If we're planting a native prairie, for example, this is where we want to look at the times of year where we have freeze and thaw cycles. And it's called frost seeding, where let's say you're getting into mid-October, or on the other end, you're getting in like mid-March, mid to early March even, where we have, you have your site prepped beforehand. So there's going to be good seed to soil contact. You don't have a bunch of organic residue on the soil surface. You can seed while these freeze thaw cycles are happening, because when the freezing happens, we have expansion, and when it thaws, we have contraction. And so those rhythms, those cycles, that helps to incorporate the seed into the soil really naturally. So some friends that I'm working with on 160 acres down in Wisconsin in Spring Green, they seeded this native prairie seed. They mixed it with corn, ground up corn bits, corn feed, and it worked really, really well. They got really even dispersal, and that 10-acre prairie, and my mom can attest, it filled in so nicely. We had coneflower, switchgrass, drop seed, all come in that first year. A number of other plants. The establishment was excellent there, and that was after soybeans had been grown with Roundup and all that nasty stuff just a year before. I'll move down here. So here we get into some exciting stuff. So we're not just talking about open fields now. We're talking about if you've got a woodland area, if you've got an edge, and so much of our residential landscapes especially are edge conditions, and that's why we have so many so many of the same species of birds, but a lot of birds like these edge conditions and these shrubby areas. That's one reason why it's important to create patches in the forest in certain places. So some of these kind of shrubby thickets come through and the birds can find some real habitat beyond the dreaded buckthorn. So these are all faster growing plants. Witch hazel on the bottom left and the serviceberry with the purple berries are less fast growing than the highbush cranberry, which has the red berries, the elderberry in the top middle, and the hazelnut on the bottom right. Those three that I mentioned are quite fast growing shrubs that can fill in areas where you may have had buckthorn. And if you're in deep shade, you might be looking at some other shrubs, although all these plants to a certain degree can handle that shade. And witch hazel I've seen do very well in the shade. This is black elderberry, and I put that in because it's deliciously edible. It does not contain the cyanide precursors that the European elderberry does, so this is safe to eat without cooking. I drink cold pressed elderberry juice, and Kim knows I I consult with elderberry growers in our area as well, which has become a real passion project of mine. But the red elderberry, and you may have seen around in the shady areas, it can really fill in and grows quite quickly. So there are some great shrubs that bring in some real wildlife value that grow quickly enough to help compete with buckthorn if you take it out. And another great trick with buckthorn is to put a tin can or upend some pipe and put duct tape on one end to cover buckthorn stems so that they don't get exposed to light once you cut them down. And in a few years, that buckthorn often will be dead. That's what we do at the Blueberry Farm. Shady woodland. This is another area where I find a lot of people are just looking for what can I do that's really low maintenance that'll fill in. And I do want to emphasize fill in because all these plants do spread, but they are native. And on the left here, we've got our beautiful wild geranium, provides forage for a number of different insects. And also with pretty much any of these plants, you can guarantee that the leaves are going to be food for some type of insect larvae. Maybe it's going to be forage for an animal of some kind as well, another larger animal. In our middle one here, I'm always surprised at this. So few people seem to be aware of this, that our ostrich fern here, which has a canoe-shaped, U-shaped stem, and it's here around so many places. There are some other ID considerations to identify this properly. I always recommend looking at a book or going around with somebody who's really knowledgeable before you really try a wild edible or mushroom especially. But this is our native edible fiddlehead, and it is absolutely delicious. You do have to parboil it for at least a few minutes, and the water will turn brown. That gets these oxalic acids out of the fiddlehead. I never even season this. It's delicious. It tastes like this crisp, spinachy flavor. On the bottom right, we've got wild ginger, which is actually pollinated by beetles. And you'll see, oh man, it might be June. Somebody else might know the actual time offhand, where the flowers are open. They're out in the summer, and you will see that they're right along the ground, so the beetles can crawl right in, which is pretty cool. Different carrion beetles. The flower looks like rotting flesh. And on the top right, we've got our Solomon seal, and the spring shoots of which are similar in flavor to kind of like a cucumbery a flavor, in my opinion, and are cooked similarly to asparagus. So these a couple of these have edible uses that I've personally used, and then all of these will spread and fill in that lower storage perhaps under some of the shrubs that I've used. And a productive hedgerow, if you've got a sunny area where you just want to fill in, maybe it's a privacy hedge, maybe it's along a fence row, or along the edge of your driveway, for example. Wild plum on the top left, black elderberry, and our beautiful red twig dogwood are three pretty easy to establish plants that also thrive in a number of different soil types in our area. And on the bottom, this is a wild strawberry. It's an example of really looking at how we can bring in some more of these ground covers to start to utilize that space, for example, with potentially productive plants, but also we don't just have to have mulch under our plants. We can fill in with some of those spreading natives as well. So our launch legumes program, if you're looking to bring in some more pollinator habitat in, I know that Washington County is has some priority areas for this program. You can get up to $350 cost share for doing things in your front yard that can help bring in pollinators. And that cost share doesn't necessarily have to be money out of your pocket to make up that other half. It can actually be, no pun intended, it can actually be your labor. You can actually just do the installation yourself and have that count toward that cost share, which is pretty cool. So if you're looking for a B-lawn, something like that, the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources has more information there. Also, if you're in Washington County or any county in the metro area, the conservation district offices will have information on that and potentially a class on understanding how to use it. So important points, I always love to wrap up. Actually, top left, the plant is our native alum root. I did a really fun planting at Sunfish Lake Park in Lake Elmo, adding some diversity from landscape alternative plants, which were really high quality plants last May with fourth graders. And this is really emphasizing the joy and importance, especially now, you know, we're looking at what's really important in life when life seems to come crashing down in a lot of ways with what's going on in the world. We can turn to nature, we can turn to each other, and granted, we can't necessarily all be together. That's why we've got, I don't know, 70 people on this webinar, so which is amazing. But you know, if we can't be together in large groups, one thing that I've been doing is we're keeping our safe distance here at the Blueberry Farm, but we are pruning the berries together and engaging and interacting in that way. It's making the work easier and more enjoyable, and it's healthy all around. Bringing people together is always a great thing. And if you can't right now, get out and connect with nature. It's been a true salve for my spirit in this time. So I will send out an email summary with some resources. These are some examples of my favorite books. This is, you can see Heather Holmes' book, Bees there. Some of my favorite information on wild edibles, Nature's Garden and the Forager's Harvest by Sam Thayer, who's based in Wisconsin. And I've been obsessed with the Organic Mushroom Farming and Microremediation book by Trad Cotter lately. Mushrooms are an amazing, relatively easy to establish way to produce protein and vitamin D and some really, really beneficial medicinal compounds and bring them into our diet by using, in what a lot of cases might otherwise be waste wood material. So that all being said, also we've got Evelyn Haddon's book, Beautiful No Mo Yards, and she was a Wild Ones member in the St. Croix chapter for a long time. I think she might live out west now. So that's there. We have time for some Q&A, and all right, 8:04, so an hour on the nose. If you guys do have questions, you can feel free to, we've got a couple chats, yay! So Marilyn says, what rating bricks? So that might be like, what is the optimal rating? You know, I'm really, my familiarity and knowledge of bricks is really, I'm starting to really dive into it personally. If I gave you a number offhand, it would be 10 is kind of the number that we're looking to meet or surpass. A number of 14 is like, you're doing amazing, you have really high carbohydrate and a level of productivity in your plants that comes from that soil health. What I would say also about bricks is that our native American black elderberry has a higher bricks rating than the European. And that's not to say that things from Europe are bad or anything, but it does actually have higher number of medicinal compounds and a higher bricks rating, which not only makes it healthy for us, high antioxidants, but it also makes it really great for making things like wine. And Kathy says, after landscaping with natives, some local edible natives that bumblebees like got naturally planted or came up, gooseberry, black walnut, black raspberries. I see them in East St. Paul natural areas plus plums, and it would be fun if the city nurtured them and had a program where we could take a class and get approved to harvest some. Do I know of a city that has done this? You know, so Kathy, as far as I know, and I could be wrong. Somebody put in the chat if I am wrong, but you can, at least in state parks, this is something I do. I believe it's allowed. You can harvest fruit. You can't harvest parts of plants, but you can harvest fruit. In the St. Paul natural areas, I don't know if there is, and perhaps you know because you live there. I'm out in Stillwater. I don't think there is a restriction on harvesting.
Yeah, yeah, there is.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, it's, well, nothing in, nothing out. And with a high population density, I mean, I've seen people, you know, with chainsaws taking out, you know, lumber or taking out wood. So,
weird.
But you can get, you just apply to the person who runs the park system. And
okay.
if they approve you, then you can do it. But nobody knows that. It's a rule that's been in place, you know, since St. Paul was founded, kind of thing. So I'm talking, there's just a lot of natural areas over here that are neglected that still have a lot of the native plants.
Yeah.
And anyway, so I think other cities have done it. I just thought maybe you would know who that would be, because some people just want to grow native plants because we should be doing that and it's good for the pollinators, but other people just like to eat. So that doubles the number of people that are interested in native plants. But you have to, I think I agree with the city, you know, you have to control it. I've just seen, you know, things being taken out. But okay, thanks. That was just my question. So.
Well, yeah, that's great. So I have a couple thoughts there. One is that, you know, this is a great example of the fact that we don't necessarily need to be spending a lot of time cultivating and maintaining plants for them to be productive. And if you do have black walnuts, a lot of our native fruit producing plants actually do just fine under black walnuts. It's when we get into some of the other cultivated plants like hydrangea and tomatoes that they can't handle the juglone that they produce. One thing that I recommend, Kathy, is if you haven't already contacted a local gleaners group, your local food shelf, if you don't know of a gleaning group in your area, people that come around and harvest excess fruit from the fruit trees on the boulevard, things like that, your local food shelf may know of some gleaning groups, and you may be able to band together in greater numbers and get something like that potentially approved where you could harvest from the parks. And you know, a lot of those ordinances, they exist for a reason, right? They're here to protect our natural areas and the public assets that we have. But at the same time, you know, we live in an era where, like you said, if somebody who's trained in or approved, then there isn't necessarily a reason why you couldn't go in there and be harvesting something that's freely available.
Yeah, and you know, the city does support community gardens. They could support community edible gardens.
Yeah, absolutely. And like for example, the Seattle Forest Garden, a lot of other cities, I know that St. Paul and Minneapolis both have examples of forest gardens. Mm-hmm. It's really connecting with more of those people and being able to build up that kind of threshold and momentum so that you have kind of the weight or the clout, I suppose, to be able to get some of those changes made or some of those approvals done.
Yeah, and it builds on the idea, you know, when I was surprised when gooseberries came up, but that our little yard is part of a bigger ecosystem, that the pollinators leave our yard, you know, and come back. Right. It's only as healthy as the town that we live in.
Absolutely. And really looking at, you brought up a great point, the fact that the earth doesn't end, the habitat doesn't end at our property line. And we can really think about if we have neighbors banded together, or we know people in our area who are also interested in this type of work that has so many benefits, to really look at how we might be creating corridors, or how one person might have really great soil for raspberries, and another person's got a great patch of apples, and you could perhaps, you know, trade some harvesting time or whatever, and really be connecting those nodes together in our communities from the habitat standpoint, from the edible standpoint as well. So I'll move on to Carrie's thing. Thanks so much, Kathy. That was awesome. Carrie says, I've been pulling one. Well, first she said, how would you like us to provide our email to you? Would like to get the additional info. So if you found this via Wild Ones, we can have Roger send that out. And I can give you, if you would like to ask me other questions, or if you just want to make darn sure that you get that summary, if you're not part of Wild Ones St. Croix, send me an email. I just put it into the chat. And oh, okay, I got your note there, Roger. And Carrie says, I've been pulling garlic mustard in a shaded area. What would you recommend as a good native to help cover the ground? The soil is dark and in a lower lying area. So if you've been pulling garlic mustard, Carrie, it's a good opportunity because, one, it's a good opportunity to, if it hasn't been sprayed or anything, it makes a great pesto if you're game. I really like it. What would you recommend as a good native to help cover the ground? So if you're disturbing soil or the soil is somewhat exposed, depending on how large the area is, to cover the most ground, especially if you can access it this time of year. I'm not sure with the COVID stuff going on, how accessible a lot of mail order seed is, for example, but for that, the soil is darkened in a lower lying area. One great resource that I'd recommend, just because I haven't seen the place and exactly what's going on, Prairie Moon website would be really good because they have different seed mixes that are adapted to different soil types, like maybe a higher moisture if it's lower lying area, and a high fertility soil, shady area, and shady with moisture. If there's a seed mix, which Prairie Moon has, you can look at the details and they'll have the list of the species that are in there. So that can help you mix and match, just as a general idea there. There are some, you know, I could come up with some plants that might potentially work, but I think that's probably the best bet, just since we haven't talked more. Choke cherries, James says, yeah, it's definitely a great plant for pollinators. It is edible. The birds love it. We can make various things with it. A lot of people sweeten them, for example. So Roger says, Pete, tell us a bit about Artisan Environments. So I can share with you more about that. I am super happy to, I just have to share this. Lori from Pollinator Friendly Alliance says, and if you haven't heard of Pollinator Friendly Alliance, they're amazing. They've got a great website. They do wonderful work with our cities in Minnesota, helping get rid of neonicotinoids and city management of lands and things like that. He says, oh my God, you may not know it, but the green man is behind you. Thank you, Mom, for the beautiful poster. All right, back to Artisan Environments. I'm easily distracted. So I'm so happy to have moved back here to Stillwater. I lived and designed around the country in Michigan, Oregon, Florida, doing native and edible landscapes, and learned a ton. And I'm so happy to be back here because I'm just so passionate about our floral diversity, about our wildlife diversity. I was talking with Lori a couple months ago about the fact that, you know, especially people who are, you know, if you're in the generation maybe like 50 and above, you know this much better than I would, being 31. There's just less wildlife around. We see like less butterflies, less bees, and it's concerning. And you know, it's something I feel on a daily basis. And so yes, there are a lot of critters that are gone, that have been impacted, but you know, we saw what happened with the Canada goose and the sandhill crane and the bald eagle. I'm swimming in bald eagles flying over me here. I'm really blessed here at the farm, but you know, these animals can bounce back, and it's not that all of them necessarily have that ability, because through farmland, conversion of prairie to farmland, you know, we've got less than 1% of the prairie that used to cover our land base in Minnesota. But in doing our small part, this is why I'm so passionate about this stuff. we can bring in some more enjoyment for ourselves, and perhaps as we keep building the corridors, building the patches and the larger areas, creating that connectivity for our wildlife. So what I do at Artisan Environments is I've got a deep background in both residential design and planning and in agricultural, and I'm really bringing those two together because we have, so many of us have maybe a smaller amount of land. Maybe it's 1/10 of an acre in the city. Maybe it's a few acres out in a suburb, or maybe it's more if you're out in a place like, on the fringes of Stillwater. But there's something that we can do and that I help others with at all of these scales. If it's a smaller property, we might be looking at a vegetable garden and a privacy hedgerow planting and a bee lawn and a prairie pollinator strip in the front parking strip, if that's allowed in your area. On a larger scale landscape, we might be looking at putting in a couple acres of elderberries to be able to provide habitat, pollinator forage, for example, but also be able to provide a saleable crop from the land. And what I really love looking at on the larger scale landscape is I work with landowners from, that 1/10 of an acre up to 160 or more. And that may seem crazy, but I don't know what it is. I just love working on all these different scales. And so it's really looking at, on those larger scales, how can all the different cover types on the property, and even at the smaller scale to a certain degree, how can all the different cover types create, benefit for the whole? But when we're looking at these larger landscapes, it's how can these different ecosystems and cover types, for example, the fields, the open oak woodland that's being restored, create opportunities for programming to bring in educational opportunities and chances for people just really to get out and have an experience of connecting with nature, connecting with each other, connecting with foraging opportunities, maybe spiritual opportunities, food production, and how that all happens. It's really bringing in a holistic life experience in my mind. This isn't just about plants and wildlife and food. It's about the experience that creates for us as we look to create a richer, higher standard of living that doesn't have to cost thousands of dollars to feel like you've gotten a vacation. It could be free. It could be a day-long workshop or something on a farm. It could be walking out your back door if you've had a hard day and you see the swallowtail butterfly fly across, and it's so healing. So Artisan Environments, I help people create DIY plans for the most part, where it's a detailed plan. We're looking at what's existing on site, what your lifestyle is like, what your goals are, if you're looking to make money, if you're looking to grow food, if you're looking to provide habitat, all of the above, restore certain areas, and then creating a plan for being able to implement in a well-defined step-by-step fashion that breaks things down. So I love just emphasizing the fact that the reason why a lot of us might feel overwhelmed with our landscape when looking at the whole deal is because we're such creative people. We're so excited. There's a positive reason why it feels overwhelming. We don't have to stay in that overwhelmed space if we start to break things down by what's the soil like here? What's the light condition? What's the moisture? Does the dog need a place to go do its business? Is there a great raspberry patch already here? Do we want to just add some more fruit in that area? We can look at everything in the landscape is telling us something. Even if we have a blank slate, we might have the edges where we say, well, there's information coming in here. We observe that people can see us when we're out on our back patio. Let's put in a privacy hedgerow with some native and productive plants, for example. Or we need some shade. Let's put in a river birch here for some nice dappled shade. And so the landscape's giving us that opportunity, giving us that information. And really that's what it's about for me. We can create these beautiful experiences in such a greater way than simply pretty plants in our landscapes. And also we can break things down so that they're digestible and they're approachable, and they create more and more opportunities for that higher quality of living that I think we're all looking for. That doesn't require us to spend more time in front of a computer, although I'm happy to do so to hang out with you guys. So that all being said, if there are any other questions, feel free to drop them in. Thanks so much, guys, for hanging out tonight. I'm so happy that I know a lot of us are cooped up at home, but I don't take it lightly, regardless, that you choose to spend an hour and a half with me tonight. It's just a joy for me to do this. I truly feel like it's my purpose here on the planet. If you are in the Twin Cities metro area, please come and see Blueberry Fields of Stillwater. Hopefully, you know, mid-July to mid-August, the blueberries will be ripe. So I hope everybody can come by then, that things have settled down with the COVID stuff going on. And definitely, oh, that's so great, Ava, glad to hear. Definitely, you know, connect. If you see some people you knew on here, connect, reach out, give them a call. You know, this is a great time just to say, hey, how you doing? What are you up to? And it can take our minds off of the sitting and waiting for whatever the news is going to tell us. Connecting with nature is really the solution in my mind, and connecting with each other. So with that being said, we will have a replay, and I will have that summary. So there will be a video recording. I'll put it on YouTube. That'll be available, and we'll send out both of those links together. Roger, if you do have anything else to say, feel free. You can find me at artisanenvironments.com, or pete@artisanenvironments.com is my email. If you want to reach out, even if you just got a random question, happy to answer it. It helps me understand what you guys are dealing with and looking to do.
Pete, wonderful presentation, lots of energy. You've got a few dance moves in there in front of the camera. And want to thank everybody for tuning in and being a part of our first webinar for Wild Ones, and we'll see about future Wild Ones productions. So watch the email and stay tuned. We'll see what comes next. And Pete, especially, it's generous of you to record this and then put it up and make it available. So we hadn't talked about that, but that's just kind of a bonus for all of our members, whether they were able to tune in tonight, or if not, something that they can get at their own convenience. So thanks again for being a part of this, and the check will be in the mail tomorrow.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, you guys. I'm so looking forward to seeing you all out and about. Have a beautiful week, and get some seeds started, get outside and see what's popping up. There's a lot of cool stuff happening out there. See you all around. Ciao.